Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be left alone on the frontier, fighting for survival in the dead of winter with newborn twins depending on you? In this gripping story, Harriet Nichols finds herself abandoned by her husband in a snowbound cabin. Just when her hope is nearly extinguished, a mysterious widower named Silas arrives, quiet, rugged, and carrying secrets of his own. Together they navigate threats from unscrupulous relatives, the ever-present danger of the freezing cold, and the challenge of caring for two vulnerable infants in an unforgiving land. The tension reaches a boiling point when long-lost debts and dubious claims threaten to drive Harriet and Silas from the only home she has left. How will it all end? Stick around to hear the full tale and witness the bonds of family love and resilience tested against a harsh wilderness. And if you want more powerful stories like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for more captivating frontier tales. The snow arrived far too soon that year, a silent intrusion on the wide plains that caught everyone unprepared. Where autumn should have lingered with gentle breezes, instead, a frigid wind howled across the homestead like an omen of darker times. Harriet Nichols could scarcely believe how fast the drifts gathered against her cabin, building up past the windows, until only fragile slivers of daylight shone through. She spent most of her waking moments tending the fire hunched in her rocking chair by the hearth, with her two infants, Toby and Lily, bundled tight against her chest. They fussed and whimpered, newborn cries muted by the thick fabric she used to cocoon them from the biting cold. Harriet's palms were raw red from perpetual exposure to the elements, her fingernails caked with the remnants of soot and dried flour. She tried to ignore the ache in her joints, the soreness in her shoulders from feeding and holding the twins day and night, but it gnawed at her constantly. Her husband Lewis had ridden off 19 days prior, promising to be back by nightfall with supplies from the nearest settlement and possibly a doctor, if one could be spared. Won't be but a few hours, he'd said. Harriet remembered the forced smile he wore, as if he was already halfway gone, even before mounting the horse. She believed him then because, for all his shortcomings, Lewis had a way with words that made her heart stir with reluctant hope. Yet those few hours had morphed into days then, over 2 long weeks. The first few nights she slept clutching the memory of his voice, convinced that at any moment she would hear hoofbeats outside the cabin. When those hoofbeats never came, she tried to justify the delay. Perhaps the snow had halted him in town, or the horse had thrown a shoe. Yet deep in her belly, a colder truth settled. Lewis was not coming back, at least not in time to rescue her from the harshness of this winter. Harriet had never meant to be so alone. Barely a year ago, she stood before a small group of dusty-faced children in a lean-to chapel, teaching them letters and hymns. Her life was once predictable, anchored by daily lessons and Sunday prayers. Then Lewis swooped in, clever tongue and a crooked grin, spinning tales of open land and fresh possibilities. She had listened enraptured, even when he was vague about how they would survive. She told herself it was love that compelled her to say yes to his marriage proposal. Love and maybe the allure of a life that felt bigger than the cramped village that whispered too many judgments behind her back. But once they made it out to this stretch of prairie, Harriet realized how ill-prepared Lewis was for the real work. He drank too often. He complained about the weather, the dryness of the soil, the sheer effort required to keep a homestead upright. When Harriet discovered she was expecting twins, she thought it might kindle his devotion. And perhaps it did, but only briefly. After the babies were born, Lewis looked at them with the barest flicker of interest, then turned his attention to anything else. Horses, the trackless horizon, the whiskey bottle. Now, with the entire world locked in ice, Harriet found herself truly alone, bereft of neighbors, of family, of any prospect of rescue. She still had enough grit to go outside and swing the axe for more wood, but every blow drove fresh agony through her arms. Each time she laid the babies down to rest, she paused to make sure they were still breathing. Cold seeped through the logs of the cabin and stung her face even indoors. As dawn rose on the 19th day since Lewis's departure, Harriet felt the edges of despair creeping closer like wolves circling beyond the dim glow of her firelight. That morning, Harriet pushed herself outside to gather more wood. The snowdrifts were waist-deep in places, forcing her to take slow, plodding steps. She wore a pair of old boots whose seams had long since split, wrapped in strips of burlap she salvaged from potato sacks. By the time she reached the stump where her axe lay half buried, her breath came in short, ragged puffs. The sky was an empty gray, mirroring the sense of hollowness in her heart. She imagined her footprints behind her filling with snow. As soon as she made them erasing evidence that she was even alive. Each swing of the axe tore at the muscles in her arms, but she pressed on, determined, and Lily needed warmth, and there was no one else to provide it. Back inside, she found the twins stirring. Toby hiccuped a soft cry. Lily merely wriggled in silence. They were so fragile, each scarcely larger than a loaf of bread. Harriet knelt by the makeshift cradle, a trunk lined with pine boughs and ragged bits of flannel, and confirmed both were breathing. Relief spread through her, followed quickly by the pang of her empty stomach. She had run low on food 2 days ago. The last of the beans had been boiled so thin it was practically bean-flavored water. In a stroke of desperation, Harriet had tried to feed herself on pine needle tea, hoping the faint nutrients might be better than nothing. She knew if her milk dried up entirely, the twins would be in mortal danger. Yet she had no alternative. She prayed for strength. She wasn't sure she possessed, feeling a fierce love for her children that dwarfed her self-pity. On the 20th night, she was startled awake by a muffled sound outside. Her first fearful thought was that coyotes had finally found the cabin. She snatched the rifle from its mount above the mantel, fumbling as she checked if it was still loaded. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she approached the window. The frost on the glass obscured her vision, but she could just make out a shadow moving among the pines. Too large for a coyote, too deliberate. It moved closer, paused, and retreated. Harriet didn't sleep much after that. She sat near the glowing embers, rifle across her knees, waiting for dawn. When morning came, her limbs were stiff from exhaustion and tension. She tried to stir up the last bit of oats, mixing them with melted snow to stretch them further. Toby coughed a little, a wet, raspy sound that sparked panic in Harriet's chest. With no doctor for miles and no medicine to speak of, all she could do was keep him warm and pray his tiny body fought off whatever threatened him. Before noon, she heard it again, the crunch of footsteps on fresh snow. This time it stopped at her door. Harriet's pulse hammered as she hoisted the rifle. A single knock, timid yet intentional, sounded. She eased the door open a crack and her gaze met a pair of calm gray eyes beneath a fur-lined hat. A man stood there, ice clinging to his beard, a loaded mule behind him. He did not speak right away, only held her gaze with a quiet intensity, as if weighing how best to approach her. Harriet kept the barrel of the rifle pointed down, but she did not lower her guard. The man produced a small burlap sack from his saddlebag and placed it gently on the threshold. "Saw smoke," he said in a voice like gravel, underfoot. "Figured you might be needing something." Harriet's mind whirled. She had been sure no one lived within a day's ride, and yet here he was, a stranger appearing out of the swirling snow, as if conjured by her desperation. Despite her suspicion, she felt a tug of gratitude. She flicked her eyes to the sack, wanting to see its contents, yet not willing to let him inside. He seemed to read her hesitation. "It's yours, ma'am," he said, stepping back from the door. "I'll be on my way." Then, as quietly as he had come, he turned and walked toward his mule. Harriet stood stunned, the rifle still braced in her trembling hands. She waited until he and the mule melted into the whiteness of the trees, then carefully set the rifle aside and dragged the sack indoors. Inside were dried apples, a small pouch of oats, a candle stub, and a tin of salve that smelled faintly of pine. Harriet stared at these items, overwhelmed by equal measures of relief and confusion. Why would a stranger help her without demanding anything in return? She made a thin porridge that night, mixing the new oats with melted snow. The babies drank from a spoon, Toby with a sputtering cough, but enough appetite to reassure Harriet, Lily with small hungry sips that eased Harriet's anxiety over their future. After they fell asleep, Harriet found herself stroking the smooth side of the tin salve. She applied a tiny dab to her chapped hands, wincing at the sting. Then for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment of unguarded tears. Perhaps she was not as forsaken as she believed. The memory of those calm gray eyes lingered, as did the quiet conviction in the man's voice. For several days after Harriet saw no more sign of him, the thought that he might have been a passing traveler, never to return, sank into her belly like a stone. The renewed supply of oats allowed her to ration carefully, so at least Toby and Lily could keep up their strength. She continued her weary chores, chopping wood, mending the leak in the roof where melting snow seeped in. Her body was an unrelenting ache, but a thread of hope now pulled her forward. Sometimes she left a portion of her meager meals outside near the chopping stump, unsure why, perhaps an unspoken invitation, or a silent thanks. On the morning Toby's cough worsened, Harriet's fragile sense of composure began to fracture. His little face burned with fever, and his breathing sounded wet and strained. She tried every remedy she knew, warm compresses, shallow baths, even a whispered lullaby, that once soothed restless children in her old schoolhouse. Nothing seemed to help. Lily wailed in response to Toby's distress, adding her voice to the small realm of Harriet's cabin. Panic clawed at Harriet's throat. She pressed Toby against her chest, tears spilling down her cheeks. She did not care about her own hunger or the biting draft that snaked beneath the door. If Toby's fever grew any worse, Harriet feared losing him. Then that night when Harriet had nearly given in to despair, she heard the hinge on her door squeak. Her head whipped around, and there stood the stranger once more, the cold swirling behind him. Before she could speak, his gaze fell on Toby. "Let me see him," he said in that same calm voice. Caught between alarm and desperate relief, Harriet let the man approach. She noticed the broadness of his shoulders beneath a threadbare coat, the lines of fatigue etched into his face. He knelt by her side, reaching out with surprising gentleness to feel Toby's forehead. "He's burning up," the man murmured, sliding off his gloves and rummaging in his pack. He produced a small flask, uncorked it, and waved it beneath Harriet's nose. The pungent scent of pine and something bitter stung her senses. "We'll rub a drop of this on his chest," he explained. "Might help loosen whatever's clogging his lungs." With delicate care, he applied the tincture to Toby's skin, massaging tiny circles. Harriet tried not to shiver from the proximity of a stranger in her home, but fear for her son overrode any caution. Toby gave a small cough, an oddly productive one, and Harriet felt a flicker of hope. "I'm Harriet," she said at last, voice quivering. The man looked at her. "Name's Silas," he replied. In the subsequent hush, the only sounds were Toby's labored breaths and the wind scraping against the door. They stayed up the entire night, Harriet rocking Toby by the fire while Silas added wood and stirred the embers to keep the cabin warm. Lily dozed off, lulled by the occasional murmurs from Harriet, who recited half-remembered hymns to soothe her own nerves as much as the baby's. Silas, for his part, remained vigilant. He crouched near Toby, sometimes feeling the boy's forehead, sometimes checking Harriet, as if concerned she might collapse from sheer exhaustion. She noticed how carefully he moved, how each gesture was measured to avoid startling her. When dawn broke, Toby's fever had not vanished, but seemed to have stabilized. Silas rose, stretching his stiff limbs. "He'll pull through if the fever doesn't spike again," he said quietly. Harriet nodded, tears in her eyes. She did not know how to thank him. Before she could utter a word, Silas made for the door. "Hey!" she called. He hesitated, turning his head. Harriet swallowed hard. "Will you come back?" A flicker of something passed through his eyes, something that looked like sorrow, shadowed with regret. "Reckon so," he replied, his voice almost too soft to hear. Then he slipped out into the pale light. Harriet stared at the closed door long after the whine of the wind swallowed the sound of his boots on the snow. For the first time in weeks, Harriet felt something other than bleak survival. She felt a faint flicker of faith, not in miracles, but in a human kindness that could turn up unexpected in the hardest places. Silas had not asked for payment, nor pressed her for details about Lewis's absence. He had stepped into her struggle, then vanished as quickly as he arrived. Shaking off her fatigue, Harriet checked Toby again. His cheeks were flushed, but his breathing was more even. Lily stirred hungry. Harriet held both children close, heart pounding with cautious optimism. Winter had not loosened its grip, and she had no illusions about the challenges still ahead. But she was no longer fighting this battle in utter isolation, and that changed the entire shape of her reality. In the days that followed, Harriet built a fragile routine around the unpredictability of Silas's visits. She never knew when or if he would appear, but he had said he would return, and that alone gave her strength. Each morning she rose before the twins woke. She measured out scant handfuls of oats for their meals, then slipped outside to hack at the frozen stump for fuel. Her wrists ached, her breath came in frosty clouds, but she persisted. Lily grew more active, letting out tiny wails whenever Harriet shifted her from one arm to the other. Toby still tired easily, yet his cough abated enough that Harriet could feed him without fear of him choking. Every small sign of improvement felt like a gift she dared not squander. Sometimes in the hush of late afternoon, she glimpsed footprints in the snow near the stand of pines behind the cabin. Once she thought she heard low whistles, as if someone were calming a mule. By the time she gathered the courage to look, she saw only the blur of white and brown that might have been Silas's coat. Rather than be alarmed, Harriet felt oddly comforted. It was as though he was keeping watch from a distance, making sure Toby pulled through his illness. She decided he was a man used to wide open spaces and the hush of the land, perhaps not wanting to intrude on her small domestic sphere unless necessary. Then one afternoon, Harriet stepped outside to empty a bowl of wash water and found Silas leaning against the corner of the cabin. Her heart lurched. She'd become so used to the lonely quiet, the presence of someone else startled her. Yet Silas's posture was relaxed, his expression gentle. "Didn't mean to spook you," he said. "Just came by to see how the boy's doing." Harriet exhaled, feeling the tension slip from her shoulders. "Better," she said simply. "Thank you." She wanted to say more to convey how his help had likely saved Toby's life, but words tangled in her throat. Silas nodded, gaze drifting to the cradle inside. She followed his line of sight, noticing how carefully he observed Toby's breathing. Lily's occasional kick, Harriet began, then paused. "There's coffee inside," she offered. In truth, it was a bitter brew made from dried roots. But it was warm, and all she had to give. Silas accepted the offer with a slight incline of his head. He slipped inside, carefully unbuttoning his coat, as Harriet stoked the fire and set a small pot on to warm. She tried not to stare at the lines in his face or the hollows under his eyes. His coat had patches along the sleeves, and his boots bore scuff marks that implied many long miles. In the stillness, Harriet realized how much she'd missed another adult's presence, how the simplest act of pouring a second cup of coffee felt foreign, yet comforting. Silas sipped, slowly, eyes studying the flickering flames. He did not ask about Lewis or why Harriet was alone with newborn twins. Harriet did not pry into his past, though she sensed tragedy lingered behind his measured silence. Instead, they talked about practical matters, how best to store the little food Harriet had, how to insulate the windows with spare cloth, whether the creek would freeze solid enough for ice blocks she could melt later. When Silas rose to go, Harriet mustered her courage. "You could stay," she said. "Not sure if it was the right thing to offer. At least for the night, it's bitter out." Silas's expression flickered, a mix of gratitude and hesitation. Next time, he replied quietly, touching the brim of his hat, "I'll bring some more supplies if I can." And with that, he was gone again. Winter dragged on, relentless, yet subtly changing. Days lengthened by a few extra minutes of sun, and the wind, while still cold, no longer felt like the sharpest blade. Harriet noted these shifts with cautious optimism. Watching icicles form along the eaves and drip by midday, forming small puddles that refroze each night. Toby and Lily gained strength little by little. They slept more soundly, and Harriet's routine grew more manageable with Silas's occasional help. He might turn up after twilight, a quiet figure leading his mules, sometimes bearing a tin of beans or a handful of jerky he'd traded for in a distant settlement. At other times, he brought intangible gifts, a new way of binding Lily so Harriet could keep her hands free, or advice on how to wrap Toby's chest in warm cloth soaked with herbs. Each small act of assistance spoke volumes about Silas's character. Harriet still guarded her heart. Painful memories of Lewis reminded her not to trust too quickly, but Silas never pried, never overstepped. On the rare evenings he accepted her invitation to stay, he spread his blanket on the floor near the fireplace, never presuming closer. Harriet grew used to seeing him stretch out there after stoking the flames, a pensive silhouette in the dim light. Sometimes she caught him staring into the fire with a faraway expression, as though reliving a past he had no words for. She wondered who he had lost and how his sorrow compared to hers. One raw morning, Harriet mustered the strength to haul herself out to the well. She was relieved to find it hadn't frozen solid. As she pulled up the bucket, her body trembled with exhaustion, her arms quivering with the effort. Suddenly, Silas was there, silent as a cat in the snow, lifting the bucket for her. "Shouldn't strain yourself," he murmured, guiding the water indoors. She was too weary to argue, simply grateful for his help. In that moment, she felt a flutter in her chest that wasn't entirely related to relief. Their bond deepened when Lily, typically the quieter twin, fell ill. Like Toby, she spiked a fever, refusing to eat. Harriet spent a sleepless night cradling Lily, tears of frustration streaming down her face. "Not again," she whispered, the memory of Toby's sickness still fresh. Her prayers, if they could be called that, mingled with fear. Around midnight, Silas returned from a brief trip to the nearest settlement and found Harriet rocking Lily by the dying embers. He knelt gently, checking Lily's forehead, then rummaged in his satchel. He boiled water, crushed some dry leaves, and steeped them into a bitter brew. Harriet had never tasted before. Lily drank a spoonful, fussed, then drank another. By dawn, her fever broke, leaving Harriet trembling with relief. When Harriet finally sat down beside the cradle, Silas placed a hand on her shoulder. "Get some rest. I'll keep watch." Harriet found she couldn't protest. She curled up on a makeshift pallet, exhaustion dragging her under. Before she drifted off, she glimpsed Silas crouching by the twins, his strong, rough hand resting protectively on Lily's tiny chest. Maybe, Harriet thought dreamily, This was what hope looked like. An unexpected ally who appeared when the storm was at its worst. But as winter's fury began to mellow, the outside world finally stirred. Harriet had all but forgotten that other human beings existed besides Silas and her slumbering children. The nearest settlement, some said, was just over a day's ride away. But Harriet had never ventured that far on her own. Lewis had been the one who handled trips for supplies, though apparently not well. Now that Silas came and went, Harriet felt the tenuous link between herself and civilization reawakening. Yet with that connection came a new threat. Men like Lewis's cousin Roderick Abbott had an interest in the land that Harriet and Lewis had settled on. Harriet had no official documents to prove her rightful ownership. Lewis had promised to file the proper paperwork, but never followed through. The only evidence of her claim was the cabin itself, built with Harriet's own blood and sweat as much as Lewis's fleeting effort. Harriet first learned of Roderick's intentions when he showed up unannounced one blustery afternoon. She had just put Toby and Lily down for a nap when a hard, aggressive rapping sounded on the door. Startled, she hurried to answer. Roderick stood there flanked by two grim-faced men, all of them wearing the scowl of men looking for a fight. Harriet stiffened, uncertain whether to reach for the rifle. "Ma'am," Roderick said, tipping his worn hat with a mocking gesture. "Heard my cousin. Lewis never came back. Thought I might see what's left behind." Harriet swallowed her anger. She recognized Roderick's cunning gaze. He had always been the sort who sniffed out advantage wherever he could. If Lewis was truly gone for good, Harriet's position here was precarious. Roderick brandished a piece of paper. "Here's the claim to this plot. Lewis owed me a debt. See, reckon that means I can come collect." Harriet's heart pounded, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "I don't owe you anything, Roderick. I built this place. My children live here. You have no right." "Don't talk to me about rights," Roderick spat. "Lewis promised me this land. If he couldn't repay his loans, you can't hold it on your own. Where's your man? Surely not that drifter I heard about lurking around." His eyes flicked to the small sign of a second bedroll near the fire. Harriet's stomach twisted. "He knows about Silas." She kept her face impassive, but a swirl of panic rose in her chest. She had no legitimate claim in the eyes of men like Roderick. She had no money to pay him off. No notarized deed, nothing but the memory of her own sweat dripping into the soil as she worked this homestead. Just then the door opened behind her. Silas stepped in, quietly closing it against the wind. He regarded Roderick and his men without a hint of fear. "You're trespassing," he said, voice low and calm. Roderick's thin smile curled with contempt. "You threatening me, cowboy?" Silas's eyes narrowed. "Not threatening, just stating fact. There's a woman and her babies here who aren't leaving, so you best turn around." For a long moment, Harriet thought violence might erupt. Roderick's men shifted uneasily, each with a hand close to the hilt of a knife. But something in Silas's steady stance made them hesitate. "I'll be back with the law," Roderick snarled, stepping back onto the porch. "One way or another, this place will be mine." Harriet waited until they rode off before she let out the breath she'd been holding. Her hands trembled. Silas reached out, resting a palm gently over hers. "We'll figure it out," he promised. Harriet and Silas spent the following days in subdued tension, fortifying the cabin as best they could. Silas checked the rifle, cleaned and oiled its mechanisms, and taught Harriet the basics of reloading quickly. While Harriet gathered all the paltry scraps of documentation she possessed. Letters from Lewis, notes he'd scribbled about the land's boundaries, even a few receipts from the settlement store. None of it was official, but she hoped it might carry some weight if they had to argue their case. Despite the grimness of the situation, Harriet felt a fierce resolve rising within her. This cabin was more than just wood and nails. It had become the cradle of her children's survival. She refused to let Roderick tear it away. At night, after Toby and Lily had drifted off, Harriet and Silas would share the single chair by the fire, sometimes in silence, sometimes swapping stories about their past. She learned that Silas had once been married, though he spoke of it only briefly, his voice tight with unprocessed sorrow. A flood had claimed both his wife and daughter, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a mule that once belonged to a neighbor. After that tragedy, Silas wandered, working odd jobs on ranches, never staying in one place long enough to form attachments. Harriet realized that the quiet tenderness she saw in his interactions with Toby and Lily was likely the echo of a father's vow of a love snatched away by cruel fate. Her own heartbreak, though different, felt akin to his. Lewis's abandonment wounded Harriet's pride as well as her heart. She had married him, believing his charm would sustain them, that together they could make something new and honest. Instead, she'd found herself abandoned in the wilderness, with twins who depended on her for every breath. Yet now in the flicker of candlelight, Harriet understood something about Silas. Broken souls recognize one another. Their unspoken bond was built not on pity, but on mutual respect for the scars each carried. When Roderick finally returned, he arrived with a haggard man wearing a tin star pinned to his coat, a local lawman named Pratt. Silas and Harriet stepped onto the porch to meet them, the rifle resting casually in Silas's grip. Pratt surveyed the property with a resigned look, clearly aware he was caught in a messy dispute. Roderick thrust forward his paper, some scrawled statement about Lewis's supposed debt. Harriet offered her own scraps of evidence. Pratt sighed, flipping through the contradictory pages. Then he cleared his throat. This is unsettled land at best. If Mr. Nichols is truly gone, that complicates matters. She can't hold it alone, Roderick insisted. She's got no official deed and she's not even married. It's squatters' rights. At best, Silas's gaze locked with Pratt's. Yet she's built this place and she's caring for 2 infants. Does the law have no room for a woman's rights to her homestead? Pratt hesitated, scuffing the snow with a boot. In most cases, if the husband is absent for a certain length of time, the wife can claim stewardship. But that's not always how these matters go, Roderick smirked. Harriet's pulse pounded as she gripped Silas's forearm, silently willing him to remain calm. Pratt scratched his chin, flipping through Harriet's documents with visible discomfort. Widow or not, the law's messy around these parts, he muttered. If Mr. Nichols is presumed dead or gone for good, there's a chance Harriet can claim it through homesteading rules. But if Roderick has any proof of debt or partial ownership, that complicates it. Roderick seized on the uncertainty. Lewis and I had an agreement. He said, his tone triumphal. Either repay the loan or sign over the land. He didn't repay, so it's mine. Harriet felt her temper flare. That agreement was never witnessed nor filed. You can't just wave a piece of paper around and declare yourself king. Silas stood firm beside her, the rifle at his side. The lawman frowned at Roderick. You have a legitimate ledger showing Lewis's debt. Roderick shifted uneasily. It was an informal understanding. Pratt let out a heavy breath. Then it holds no more weight than Harriet's stake. Fact is, this woman's living here with 2 children, and from what I can see, she's improved the land more than Lewis ever did. Unless you bring a judge from the bigger town to settle it, I'd say you're out of luck. Roderick's face twisted in anger. He glanced at Silas, then back at Harriet. Mark. My words, he snarled. I'll be back with more than just a piece of paper yet. Harriet caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He understood that forcibly removing her would bring the wrath of both the law and a determined ex-soldier or cowboy. Whatever Silas was, the tension hung thick as a storm cloud for a long moment. Eventually, Pratt handed the papers back. I'd advise all of you to let this lie until warmer weather, he said, turning his horse away. Then if you want to fight it out in a real court, you can. But I won't watch a family get tossed out in the snow. Silas and Harriet remained on the porch as Roderick and Pratt rode off. The swirling wind swallowed the sound of hooves, leaving the clearing eerily silent. Harriet's chest felt tight relief and residual fear tangling inside her. She turned to Silas, found him watching her with an intense gaze. You stood by me, she said softly. His expression softened. Where else would I be? Her heart thumped as she realized how deeply she had come to rely on his presence. That night, as Toby and Lily slept, Harriet let Silas into the small boundaries of her personal space more freely. They sat side by side on the rug by the fire's shoulders, touching the flicker of flames dancing across the rough-hewn walls. Harriet spoke of her old life as a schoolteacher, of how she used to read dusty books by the lamplight and dream of far-off places. Silas confided in her about the flood that took his wife and daughter, how the memory still haunted him in nightmares. They were 2 battered souls adrift in a harsh land, but for the first time, Harriet felt that sense of aloneness begin to heal. When she leaned her head against his shoulder, he placed a tentative arm around her. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of that simple gesture seep into her bones. For the first time since Lewis rode off, she believed she could build a future here, one not shaped by abandonment, but by the quiet determination to survive and find love in the midst of hardship. Spring arrived in subtle degrees, first by lengthening the daylight hours, then by diminishing the punishing storms. The snow crust gave way to slushy puddles and the roof of the cabin dripped steadily each morning. Harriet noticed tiny spears of green poking through the patches of bare earth around the cabin's foundation. The twins, now a few months old, responded to the gentler weather by growing more animated. Lily kicked her feet when Harriet carried her outside for a short breath of fresh air. Marveling at the changing world, Toby babbled happily whenever Silas appeared in the doorway with more wood or a bundle of newly acquired supplies. Life still wasn't easy. Harriet wrestled with the knowledge that Roderick might return, yet days stretched into weeks and there was no sign of him. Perhaps the combination of the lawman's reluctance and Silas's quiet intimidation convinced Roderick to bide his time. Harriet continued her small improvements. She patched the drafty spots in the walls, cleared a modest path from the porch to the stump. When she found time, she even scribbled in a journal, capturing in shaky handwriting the triumphs and sorrows that had marked her first true winter alone on the homestead. Silas stayed not in a dramatic sweeping gesture, but in small, consistent acts that anchored him to Harriet's life. He repaired the barn door until it no longer rattled in every gust of wind. He hunted small game, supplementing Harriet's meager pantry with fresh meat. He scouted the edges of the property, noting which areas might be suitable for a vegetable garden once the land fully thawed. Harriet, for her part, shared what she could of her teacher's knowledge. She taught him to read short passages from the single book she possessed, a tattered Bible she had taken from the chapel. While Silas stumbled over some words, he persevered, a light kindling in his eyes whenever he mastered a tricky sentence. In those quiet lessons, Harriet felt the closeness between them deepen, a slow-building trust that left her both comforted and exhilarated. Sometimes at twilight, they would sit on the porch with Toby and Lily nestled in blankets, watching the sky turn purple and pink behind the distant hills. Silas's arm would curve around Harriet's shoulders, and she would allow herself to rest her head against him. They spoke little during these moments, content to share the hush of the land winding down for the evening. Harriet could hardly remember a time she felt so at peace, even though she knew challenges lay ahead. The memory of Lewis drifted through her mind now and then. She wondered if he was alive somewhere, or if he had perished in a storm. No one had come with a final word. Harriet realized she no longer felt the pang of guilt or love for him she once did. She simply felt sadness that his choices had led him away from a life he could have built here, one full of resilience and tender possibility. On a sun-warmed afternoon, Silas took the first steps toward building a small corral using deadfall from the woods. Harriet watched him work, Toby gurgling in her arms, Lily squirming next to her. She saw in his methodical hammering the same steady patience that had saved Toby's life, the same quiet devotion that had upheld her when she felt she might crumble. The children were too young to understand the significance of these shifts, but Harriet believed they sensed the gentle steadiness Silas brought. Each day he stayed. Harriet felt more certain he was not here out of pity or a passing sense of responsibility. He had chosen this place and, by extension, chosen them. Late that evening, when both babies were finally asleep, Harriet stepped outside. The moon shone bright over the clearing, reflecting off the lingering patches of snow. Silas stood by the corral, leaning on a fence post. Harriet approached him, her shawl pulled close around her shoulders. "I never expected to find someone again," she said, voice raw with honesty. Silas turned, his eyes somber but warm. "Nor did I," he murmured, sliding an arm around her waist. Harriet angled her face up. When he bent his head, their lips met in a slow, gentle kiss, an understanding forged by hardship, sealed by mutual care. In that moment, Harriet felt the stirring of a future she had never dared to hope for, a future free from the shadow of abandonment, anchored instead by love's quiet determination. And in the hush of the prairie night, with the wind at rest and the sky vast and open, Harriet knew they would face whatever came next together. Looking back on Harriet and Silas's journey, it's remarkable how they forged a new kind of family in the most unforgiving of circumstances. Despite personal sorrows and the looming threat of losing the homestead, they found strength in unity. Harriet discovered that love could bloom again, even after betrayal and heartbreak. Silas, burdened by his past, learned that caring for others can bring peace to one's own soul. Through nights of chopping wood, tending fevers, and defending what little they had, they built something precious, a sense of belonging. From my perspective, this tale reminds us that hope often emerges strongest in the face of hardship. By standing together and learning to trust Harriet, it allows redefined home not just as a place, but as the warmth we share with those we love. I invite you all to share your thoughts and comments below. What part of their journey resonated with you most and why? Let's keep the conversation going.